Good evening, welcome. I'm Andy Murray, the Executive Director of the Major Projects Association. It's my privilege to welcome you all here this evening and do the boring bit, which is the housekeeping, and introduce the timings for our proceedings this evening. So there is no planned fire drill tonight, so if we hear the alarms, we have to treat it for real. You can see we have the fire exits here and here. Do follow the signs all the way out, and the muster point is the pub across the road. Whoever's in first, get your credit card out. You may notice that the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore is not on stage with us because we've got democracy in action. He's been called to vote, and I've just heard that there's not going to be a vote, so he's coming straight back to join us. So, some great news. We prepared for this as an option, and rather than hearing from just Chris Skidmore this evening, we're also going to hear from our chair, Emma Howard Boyd, who's recently been appointed by the London Mayor to lead a review, the London Climate Resilience Review. So we're going to hear about resilience as well as net zero. So we're going to hear from Emma first. Hopefully that will allow time for Chris to get back from Westminster, get his microphone on, and then he's going to give his talk on net zero. And not just there, we haven't just got Emma and Chris talking, we also have our friend and infrastructure journalist, Anthony Oliver, who's going to ask some questions on your behalf to get us going, and then open the floor for all of you to ask questions of both Emma and Chris. So I'm not going to delay anymore. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. And I think what we've shown this evening, is how we're all going to need to adapt our plans. As chair of the Major Projects Association, I'm pleased that our relationship is being here in the Institution of Civil Engineers is in fantastic health. At the heart of that collaboration is the commitment to sharing experience, knowledge, and ideas to help everyone avoid mistakes and incorporate best practice. Chris will hopefully be back very shortly, but whilst this is disappointing that he's not here right from the start, as Andy's already said, this is right that democracy comes first. Sustainability has been at the forefront of the MPA's thinking since our annual conference in 2019. The Sustainability Ambassadors Network was formed as a result of the 2019 conference, and we have built on that work to make sustainability one of the association's 3 landmark objectives in our 2025 strategic plan. We produced our net zero position paper, our first ever, to coincide with COP26 in Glasgow. There we set out 6 recommendations to improve projects today and 3 recommendations to change the system for how major projects can become part of the solution. So we were delighted when Chris, who is now here, published his Mission Zero report because it highlighted the role that business can play, making better use of infrastructure and delivering more energy efficient homes. Mission Zero showed many ways to secure economic investment and jobs, all while working towards achieving legally binding targets to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we desperately need to do that. This Monday, the world experienced its hottest day on record. The World Meteorological Organization says that Europe is warming faster than anywhere else. And it's clear that major projects need to reduce carbon emissions and make better use of resources. But the elephant in the room is the rising impact of climate shocks. Last week, the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, said record-breaking droughts, heat waves and floods are already plaguing the world. They are inflicting suffering and damage on every continent and serve as a mere glimpse into the future. Not only is this a matter of justice for future generations, it is also undoubtedly a matter of justice and responsibility for today's. If we fail to get ahead of these escalating problems, we will struggle to reduce emissions because the buildings, infrastructure, systems and political economy we need to create a healthier and greener country will be put under intolerable strain. However, if we ensure that our investments in infrastructure are resilient and well maintained, there's everything to play for. but time is short. And today I'm briefly going to talk about action before handing over to Chris. I want to talk a little bit about the role that I have just been given by Sadiq Khan. Everyone in London remembers what they were doing during last year's record-breaking 40 degrees heat wave. Schools had to close, hospital operations were cancelled, and systems crashed. Wildfires caused the busiest day for the London Fire Brigade since the Second World War. Train lines buckled, homes were destroyed, and there were unprecedented numbers of heat-related deaths. I hope that we don't have heat like that again this year, but we should be preparing for it, and it could last for more time than 2 days the next time it happens. Alongside heat, by 2050, there will be 59% more winter rainfall, and increasingly summer thunderstorms are causing havoc with Londoners' lives. In 2021, flash flooding affected homes, schools, underground stations, and NHS care. Also, we must not forget the sea level in the Thames estuary is going to rise by at least a metre by the end of the century. London is currently well protected from tidal flooding by the Thames Barrier, but because of effective monitoring in the estuary, we now know the deadline for raising flood defences upstream of the barrier is 2050. This has changed from 2065 in the original plan. As the climate changes, we need to be prepared to learn and adapt our long-term planning to stay ahead. And that means we should take stock. So the Mayor of London has asked me to chair an independent review to look at how well prepared London is for climate impacts. That includes wildfires, extreme heat, floods, droughts, storms, and sea level rise. The London Climate Resilience Review will make recommendations to guide London's preparations at national, regional, and local levels. We need to learn more about how to prepare and how to recover quickly. We will look at the costs of inaction as well as the costs and benefits of acting, and we must identify specific actions we can take immediately. I want to make full use of London's strengths. This is one of the greatest cities in the history of the world, full of opportunity, innovation, and enterprise. About half of London's landmass is either green or blue, which includes parks, gardens, trees, green spaces, rivers, and wetlands. 21% of London is covered by tree canopy. But London is also a city of great inequality, and areas of significant deprivation tend to be those without the health and well-being benefits of green and blue spaces. It is a London review, but it is an opportunity to show how to make all UK cities better places from Inverness to Truro. I don't want to make esoteric policy suggestions that wind up on a dusty shelf. I want everyone to feel the benefits of living in a climate-ready UK. I want people to see how preparing for climate change improves their lives and livelihoods, and I want to see those improvements put into action. I mean to be entirely pragmatic. If something works, let's do it. And the Major Projects Association, the Institution of Civil Engineers, and all our partners can find ways to ensure that everyone benefits by bringing your practical knowledge to the challenge of tackling climate change. The call for evidence will last until September, and we'll publish the review in December. So please take part. Now, I was prepared to talk a little bit longer, but I know that you all came to hear Chris Skidmore talk about his net zero review. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Chris to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, Emma, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I wish you all the luck with the work that you're about to undertake. We had a meeting a couple of weeks back, and Emma asked me what should she take forwards with the review, what would be my recommendations. And first of all, I said, it's about the process, being as inclusive as possible. And when I took the net zero review forward, I thought my last job in government, I was an independent chair, and I'd been asked to sort of come back in after 3.5 years. So I thought it might be my last chance to influence policy, so I was going to throw everything at it. And we were given, like yourself, a short time frame, sort of 3 months to do things. And I'm sure everyone in the room knows the power of a deadline and a mandate in actually incentivizing you and pushing you forwards. After all, 3 months is 1% of our journey to net zero. It was 48 months ago that I was the energy minister responsible for signing net zero into law. Then the UK became the first G7 country to do so. We beat France by one single day, not that that had anything to do with it, but you know, there is always an element of politics, and I'll come on to the politics in a moment. But that allowed us to secure our presidency of COP26. These bids are quite funny things. There's something called the WEOG, which is, I can't remember the exact same acronym, but basically blocks of countries that have voting power, and behind the scenes as a minister, you're ringing up sort of Canadian ministers, French ministers, and trying to sort of do a deal where they might back you in this process. And there are a number of countries bidding against the UK. But once we signed net zero into law, there wasn't a single European country, regardless of what was happening with the B word, that wasn't willing to back us. Because they saw in our legislative commitment, rather than just a commitment, you know, everyone's talking about America, but they've not committed in law to net zero. They saw that we were serious about not just tackling climate change, but serious about the future, not just of the planet, but the future of our economy. And that as a government, we were willing to go further than anyone else. And when I look at the UK, demonstrating sort of climate leadership, demonstrating leadership on net zero, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, is so important for the opportunity that it now provides, because people are watching and they're waiting to see what UK government is going to do. And I know we've got a number of departmental representatives in the audience today. They're waiting to see what UK local authorities are going to do. And I think we're in a fantastic position in the UK that actually many representatives in local government want to go further, faster than central government. And that's the opposite of the case if you look at other countries. And then also for the private sector. Because above all, the message I got from going around the country, and as part of that process that I spoke to Emma about, making sure it's as inclusive as possible. I visited every region of England, went to every devolved nation. We held 52 evidence roundtables. I spoke personally to 1,000 individuals representing companies, businesses, NGOs and charities across the UK. And we had 1,800 written evidence submissions. And I can't quite see everyone tonight in the audience, but I'm sure there were people in this room who were on some of those calls. There were some who probably had the task of writing a submission. I'd like to say thank you if you did, because I didn't want it to be seen as the Skidmore review. You know, I wanted it to be seen as the review of the sectors who are involved. You had that sense of ownership, and with that sense of ownership, a sense of opportunity that the review would help deliver what they needed to see happening. And that can be divided into two parts. One is that sense of challenge. Yeah, we all know there are a number of blockages on the pathways towards net zero that we need to solve. And we can solve them as a government, with legislation, with regulation, with new standards. We can solve them as institutions and organisations that, for no fault of their own, were created in a pre-net zero world and are now not fit for a net zero purpose. So making sure our institutions, our planning systems, our permitting systems have net zero and climate compatibility at the heart of them. All that sort of work needs to happen if we're going to make our system not just fit for purpose, but we're going to accelerate the opportunity to deliver on time, on scale, and on budget. But at the same time, thinking when it comes to net zero, that actually the changes we need to make will not just be the responsibility of the government. The UN has repeatedly said this, and the academic evidence points to this, that the majority of decision-making points around sustainability and net zero are not the responsibility of government. And I'm not saying that as an easy way out. Of course, government needs to go further faster, particularly my government needs to go further faster in setting the long-term certainty, clarity, consistency, and continuity of policy frameworks, what we termed in the Mission Zero report as the 4 Cs, which hopefully will unlock the 5th C, which is confidence for the private sector, the business community and industry, that they can commit themselves to a net zero pathway. But ultimately, what I saw around the country visiting major projects. It's amazing, actually, how many people were wanting to get me on the top of a nuclear power plant, or sort of looking down from INEOS's sort of like gas storage site, right down to going down into the London Power tunnels to see what is happening right now underground in London as we prepare for our electricity system of the future. These some of the major projects already happening are already leading the way. And I think sometimes in the United Kingdom, we always focus, particularly our media, on what is going wrong, why are we not doing enough, when actually sometimes to step back and reflect how far we've come. It's fantastic to see so many organisations and major projects engaged, not just with sustainability, but delivering on net zero, and sometimes even going further towards net negative. And I think that's the other important thing to recognise, is that the innovations that will happen, the technological innovations to deliver low carbon materials, better ways of working, efficiencies, productivities, the things that you now recognise in net zero that mean you would do net zero even if there wasn't a climate crisis, which there clearly is, was one of the messages principally of the net zero review. And for me, it was also about setting a new narrative. Because for too long, over the past sort of 4 years, net zero has been seen as some kind of environmental tool that's being imposed on people, that somehow it's not needed, we're going too far, too fast. Actually, net zero is now the principal economic opportunity of this decade. As I speak, there will be boardroom meetings happening with investors deciding on where to place their international investment globally across the world. And those decisions are increasingly being made, regardless of what government decides, by individual investor communities in net zero projects. They're not being made in high carbon fossil fuel projects. And I often say to my government, when we're looking forward to the future, that we've got to be incredibly careful that we don't create the stranded assets of the future in the industries of today that will become the industries of the past. We need to work on a transition that is both just, not just for the global south, but a just transition for communities that, for no fault of their own, work in high carbon industries that will need to transition, not because governments tell them to, but because the international financial sector has woken up to the reality of where that investment is going to be placed, and the decisions that not just their shareholders want, but also the financial sense that net zero investments are making, the rates of return they are seeing on these investments. And partly why I'm so determined to get out of the blocks and champion net zero is almost as a wake-up call, to say net zero is here, and it's here to stay. This is now the future. We're not going backwards. And so understanding sooner rather than later that this is the new economic reality is so important for the UK. Not just to tackle the climate crisis, essential though that is, to ensure that in this new global net zero race, we continue to lead, because there will be no free rider opportunities in following. There will only be additional costs. And for UK businesses and industries like yourselves to demonstrate leadership in this task is going to be so important. Again, not just for the UK meeting its net zero commitments, and those are commitments obviously not just for 2050, they're commitments for 2030, the 68% emissions reduction for our national determined contribution, 78% emissions reduction for 2035. Those emissions reductions are only going to be met if we get real about the challenge on industry and infrastructure. Net zero, above all, is the infrastructure challenge of this century. And the Mission Zero report that I set out focused predominantly on issues around grid, capacity, storage, infrastructure, pipeline delays. All those need to be unblocked. But putting that aside, the challenge for industry is actually to recognise this challenge is also an opportunity to lead not just in the UK, but then to take the learning, the business models, the best practice that you have then engineered in the UK to take that abroad. And that applies as much as to standards and regulation and services as it does to the opportunity to engineer and design a net zero future. And so when the Mission Zero report came out, it made 129 recommendations to government. I think 70 of those recommendations were for this government to at least begin to start. 25 of those was what I called the 25 by 2025 that this government now, in its final year, could take forwards and complete before the next general election. But I don't know if any of you have been sort of ever written policy reports to sort of feed into government. You're always sitting around thinking, how can I have cut through? How can I have impact? Because policymakers, whether in departments or as politicians, are presented with a plethora of these reports weekly. And many of them are often just shopping lists of recommendations that need to happen. And that's fine, and many of those recommendations are well thought through. But trying to weave these recommendations together like a tapestry to set out that wider vision for why net zero, and then to focus on how net zero, is what was absolutely critical for the Mission Zero report. So it wasn't just about the 129 recommendations. It was about that mission-orientated approach, setting what I had as a 10-year horizon, because I thought if they were in place by 2025, then you could see them through to 2035. But this is a framework that you know well, because every major project is in itself a mission-orientated approach. You have to work with a multitude of stakeholders, a multitude of investors, a multitude of governance and institutional structures to come together and map out a pathway. And sometimes that pathway is not simply by looking forwards. You know this, and I didn't want to teach you this, because I feel very guilty almost of an imposter syndrome here, having to talk about this. But you work backwards. The basics of operational research are to map out those pathways which demonstrate, for energy, what is the energy mix we'll need for the future? What are the challenges if one particular work stream happens to fail or is delayed? And you work out, as a result, a roadmap. And what we haven't had in net zero is a roadmap that works backwards, not just from 2050, but from 2035, that recognises that there will be unknowable events, these black swan moments, particularly when it comes to adaptation and resilience. If we don't take the lessons that I'm sure we'll learn from Emma's report in London and take them forwards also when we look at creating the mitigation opportunities and making sure adaptation is at the centre of those for the future, so that when we build out the grid networks, we've thought about this in advance. And that hasn't happened. We've had this organic process. By now we are seeing industries and sectors coming against each other. And I'm a realist and a pragmatist, and sometimes when we took the review forward, I wanted to go further faster. Why not? But there's no point setting mandate targets if you set them up to fail. The worst thing you can do as a politician, I'm sure, in business also, is to overpromise and underdeliver. Because to overpromise and underdeliver is also to put the trust of those who have put their trust in you at risk. And actually the worst thing we can do with net zero is if we fail on some of these mandates that we have set ourselves to 2030, potentially trust and faith in the whole direction of travel towards achieving net zero on our targets of 2030, 2035 into 2050 unravels. So we can see now a test of whether we should sort of push forwards on electric vehicles with the ZEV mandate. People regularly talk about are we going to meet our heat pump targets? The net zero review was obviously putting guardrails around some of these policies to ensure against the failure of the policy. But at the same time, we are already seeing a failure of existing anticipation of where these challenges might come for the future, not least in skills. Every single round table picked up the fact that we do not have the engineers, we don't have the technicians, we don't have the site managers, the capacity to be able to build out all these different projects all at once at the same time. You can't find the welders in South Wales to work on some of their projects in Port Talbot because they've all gone down to Hinkley Point C. And unless we get real about what's needed to deliver on the under-the-bonnet basics, then we will fail. But you all know this. You've worked regularly on major projects, and I'm sure there have been projects in the past where you have not been able to deliver on time and on budget, and there have been projects that have succeeded. And you've gone away and you've looked at those projects that have succeeded, and you've delivered and you've worked out what are those elements of best practice that you can transfer across to other projects in future. And net zero will, in all honesty, we won't get it right first time. There will be bumps in the road. There will be wrong turnings. We will make mistakes. The challenge is that we don't repeat the mistakes endlessly for the future, and that we recognise the opportunity in infrastructure delivery, in infrastructure planning, that we make sure we take these best practice examples and ensure that, I like to say, end best practice. How can we take best practice and mainstream it for the future? And that is why, just to end, another critical element of net zero is not just about what happens in Whitehall, what happens in Westminster, what happens at a national level. It is also about setting that place-based approach. I've seen cities and regions set more ambitious net zero targets than the government, and yet they're on track to meet those targets because they know what needs to be delivered. They can see the industries that need the additional support. They know the communities which need to have the district heating networks. They are working on their local energy area plans to make sure that their roads aren't dug up 5 times in the next 15 years. They can actually understand, the nature of the transition because they live and breathe it daily, living in that area. And I'm determined to ensure that when it comes to net zero, the next phase of where we need to move to is to have this local big bang to ensure that when it comes to delivering on net zero, we don't just focus on government, on local authorities, on business as the major actors for delivering, but we make more people the authors of their own net zero story, ensuring that we can create a devolution process that puts additional net zero powers at the hearts of regional governments and also local authorities. I'm heading off to Bournemouth tomorrow to speak at the Local Government Association conference. I'll be echoing these messages I'm speaking to you tonight. But that will be the future of net zero, and I'm sure whoever wins power next year will wish to turbocharge this. If the Labour Party end up being in government, they will want to ensure that they can strengthen local delivery. And all of you in this room have worked at a regional level or a local level. You know what are the powers, you know what are the blockages, you know what are the restrictions that are currently in place. And it might be that having read the Net Zero Review, you think I've missed a trick. Maybe out of those 129 policy recommendations, there are others that you wish to put forward. Please do get in contact with me if that's the case. I am still keen to be on a journey to ensure that I can act as, not necessarily a lightning conductor, but a catalyst and an agent for change of putting forwards new recommendations. And so if there are opportunities where you see these best practices taking place, if there are major projects that you are focusing on, if you would like me to come and visit, if you would like me to highlight the challenges that you are seeing in your own lives, please do let me know. Net zero is a pathway. It is a pathway that we've all got to walk on together. But let's work together to ensure that we can meet the end of that pathway as fast as possible. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to take some questions.
Certainly, yes. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much, Chris. The great thing about the power of democracy means you get me tonight. So thank you very much for inviting me. Emma, do you want to come and join us as well for some questions? We've got my role tonight is just to run this Q&A session with Chris and Emma for the next half an hour or so. And as usual, I've got some fantastic questions, but I know you've got some really good ones as well. There's roving mics, so I'm going to hang on, hold your horses. I'm just going to put some questions just to get you going. Chris, you mentioned that there may well be a change of government. Well, certainly there'll be a general election in the next year or so. You've also talked about leadership. I mean, all parties, all parts of the political spectrum violently agree that meeting net zero targets is what we need to be doing. But of course, it's very, very political. It's very, very complex. And it's also, there's many, many moving parts. How do we endure the political cycles that we're going to be going through over the next decades to actually get to these solutions? Because there will be many changes of governments, many changes of policy. How do we endure that process?
So can you all hear me? Yep, you can. Partly, I had that at the back of my mind when writing the review. How do we move away, not just from changes in government, potentially, but also the spending review cycles that I think sort of bedevil the nature by which we can really enhance the opportunity for investment in this country. When you look at sort of investors not having that backing from government to say that they can commit beyond at best a 5-year investment cycle, has really challenged projects such as HS2, really challenged the ability to have faith in the future. So that's why the mission-based approach is there, because if I can get governments, regardless of any political colour, to commit to these sort of 10-year programmes, then I think that will help de-risk the costs of investment.
And it'll unlock that confidence, that fifth C.
Yeah, confidence, exactly. And I think we're beginning to see it tentatively. So what we saw with the government's response to my review is that they came forward and said that they would commit to £20 billion over 20 years for CCUS. They've established Great British Nuclear with the commitment to 2 SMRs agreed in the next Parliament. There used to be this sort of mantra, which I always thought was a fallacy, that no one government can bind the hands of another, and it's never been true. We would never have built the railways if that was the case. So trying to move slowly in this direction, it's been very difficult in the past to get the Treasury on board. When I signed Net Zero into law, I remember Philip Hammond sort of saying, who's paying for this? And I said, well, it's not as easy as that. This is about recognising the transformation and the benefits, and we never really pushed hard on that, what investment can mean and how we can grow our economy. And we now have a Treasury, I think, that's more willing to look about being agile and adaptive in its processes.
So you're less worried about that whole making sure those political cycles don't interrupt progress.
I mean, I think we are incredibly lucky. Again, it's a classic example of a very British thing of us. We always just look to where we're failing and never really focuses on the huge successes. So net zero is only possible because of the Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act was backed by all political parties. All mainstream political parties that got elected put net zero on the front page of their manifesto. When Nigel Farage tried his latest gig of trying to sort of whip up populist support against net zero, he tried to book Bolton Wanderers Stadium to hold a rally, and they told him where to go because they've got their own net zero plans where they're putting electric vehicle chargers in the car parks and creating sort of lifts for the fans to come home to decarbonise. So the reality, unfortunately, and this is living in a democratic society is very healthy, is that you get a handful of individual detractors who then dominate the media airwaves. And I passionately believe that the contrast we've got is there's no Trump figure coming out of the woodwork who's going to sweep this all away. So the challenge for international investors is actually you could choose the states, but people are really worried about, even regardless of the Inflation Reduction Act, that actually the UK is still a really good bet long term.
Okay, Emma, London Climate Resilience Review. Your focus is on building resilience. It's vital. But does that mean that all this effort that Chris is going to drive towards net zero, does that mean that we've got to give up, or we've given up on that, we're not going to hit it?
Absolutely not. But what it is doing is recognising that, yes, we need to race to net zero as quickly as possible. But we have to recognise that the climate impacts that we are now seeing today are locked in for decades and could make those net zero investments stranded because we have to make sure they are ready for the rain, for the sun, for the storms. We can't allow them to be washed away in a flood or melt in a heat wave. And so combining net zero with adaptation and resilience, climate readiness, again, it's been fantastic. Chris has been so generous with his time, understanding how to frame the narrative around adaptation and resilience. It's about being climate ready, being prepared for these climate shocks. But we have to do it together and also recognise that nature, green and blue infrastructure, can play a massive role in delivering that change.
Do you think, I'm sure they're very bright people out here, but do you think the major projects delivery community can hold those two thoughts, those two ambitions in their minds at the same time, to drive towards net zero and to build in resilience?
Again, I think it comes down to the urgency of understanding that. And we have all seen pictures after Storm Arwen. We've seen pictures of vehicle charging in built-in floodplains. This is happening at great pace. And I think we have to break out of our silos and join things up.
Well, Chris, is there a worry that by focusing on adaptation, that it takes the focus away from driving towards net zero?
No, I think there's some great examples of where focusing on adaptation and net zero complement each other. That you have a number of solar panels, for example, is a great example where actually the biodiversity gain underneath them potentially there are opportunities for creating panels that also have sort of shade and cooling underneath. And there's other examples where the design of buildings and the low carbon content that's sort of generated from them is then re-envisaging the entire sort of process by which we sort of maybe mine those materials, potentially use natural resources, that can then ensure that the natural resource can maybe be used in different ways that then actually combines to be a carbon sink. So, there are ways in which we can think that, but Emma's absolutely right. The challenge is, this is our moment. This is our real chance to do things differently, but to step up and be, you were the one who actually came up with the idea to deliver it.
Well, let me just explore that, because this room is full of delivery professionals. Is the solution, well, how do you move them from a solution about building stuff using technology to, the phrase you use is, creating a new narrative. I mean, creating new narratives, creating behaviour change is very hard. And it takes a long while compared to building stuff. Yeah. How do they get over that?
And I think it is a twin track process, and I tried to reflect that in the review, is that we've got the toolbox, we've got the regulations, we've got the practices, we've got the courses that train people in certain ways, and obviously that is what we have. So
the last thing, the courses that train people how to build stuff.
Exactly, and we can't just drop it all and that will cause further delay. So how do we use what we have at the moment and try to push it in a direction that will allow us to achieve outcomes? So like energy performance certificates, just one example, widely now agreed that they're not fit for purpose, certainly not for measuring carbon content of buildings and delivering on energy efficiency. So we need to be going back to the drawing board and understanding how do we create sort of net zero performance certificates, but we wouldn't want to stop people from delivering on energy efficiency and insulation by somebody not using EPCs. So I've sort of tried to recognise that there's a point where we've still got a lot of policy work to do. We need to make sure that policy work includes the communities, that there's no perverse incentives. The real challenge in policy is making sure that two different policies don't sort of come up against each other in a Venn diagram and create a sort of toxic moment where actually we end up going backwards. And I think that's the key challenge. But ultimately, using what we have now, we can get on with a lot of what we need to do.
And would you recognise that risk of the tendency towards solving the problem by technology, solving the problem by building stuff, as opposed to solving the problem by creating a new narrative?
Again, it has to be a combination of everything. We need every tool in the toolbox to deliver that change. When it comes to regulation, we need to make sure that those with environmental responsibilities are working with economic regulators, are working with financial regulators. And again, I think that comes out loud and clear in your review, Chris. It's at every single stage, you have to break it down to some very, very practical actions. Some of it is about how we lead as leaders, how we set our challenges. One of the proudest moments I had when I was chair of the Environment Agency was shortly after the net zero commitment, was making a net zero commitment for the Environment Agency of 2030. Much smaller organisation. We'd done a lot of work already in terms of emissions reduction. We felt we could do it, and whilst building flood defences, we decided to embed net zero into the way we ran the organisation as well. Those sorts of things, taking on a challenge, is exactly the right thing to do, and we need to do more of that, and at pace and at scale.
So before I go to the floor, throw down the gauntlet then. Ambition into action. What should they be doing?
Well, I think that, for me, the gauntlet is not just accepting net zero, but doing net zero well. Because the next challenge will be, there's plenty of companies that claim they're going net zero. And I don't want to get into sort of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 discussions here, but there's a real challenge that some organisations will claim they're going net zero, will then look to, for whatever means, try to offset their emissions, still claim it's too hard. Actually, the challenge and the gauntlet that needs to be thrown down is thinking through not just achieving net zero, but seeing what is your sort of ambition and where you can place yourself in the market internationally to be global leaders. Because I really do think that we are in this moment where UK industry and business can come out of the blocks. You can be at events like COP28, and you can be picking up opportunities internationally if that's so what you choose. You can be picking up international opportunities across the country if that's so what you choose. The customers are willing and waiting for those companies that can deliver their own net zero and climate ambitions. So don't see this as a burden, don't see this as a challenge that is an impossible one. See this as this moment that, if you seize it now, you will see the rewards.
It's a moment of opportunity. Let's get some questions. Kate.
Hello, my name's Kate Hughes. I'm from the design director from HS2. And what I was interested in was, how do you see the next generation as being the catalyst for this roadmap to an industrial revolution, effectively a green revolution? Because from what I see is that there's huge power out there of people who know that this is going to affect their lives and be really significant. And how can the members in this room help raise that voice to bring about change? Have you seen any examples of that?
So I think when it comes to the next generation, obviously there's lots of talk around eco-anxiety and whether people are worried about the climate crisis and what this will mean for their own futures. But at the same time, and it's the same with doomerism and recognising that we sat on our hands and do nothing, everything will get a lot worse. This challenge is a challenge that the science shows that we can solve, that it isn't existential. There are potential existential challenges around nature and biodiversity loss that may, regardless of what we do, be too late. But ultimately, when it comes to CO2 emissions, the science demonstrates that we can bend the curve. And so to show to young people, not that their future is being sold up the river and is too late, but that they are the generation that will come forwards and be able to help meet this challenge, I think is an incredibly attractive one. We know all the polling has shown that sort of young people increasingly now want to have a job that is a green job, and the definition of what is a green job is obviously very varied. And what you've seen Joe Biden do in the States is really get out with that narrative that I spoke around, and not necessarily talk about sustainability and green jobs, but mainstream jobs, and say if you're going to be an engineer for the future, you'll be working on net zero projects. If you're going to be a scientist, you'll be working on innovating on these projects for the future. And then, so I think it's about politics and messaging must always be about hope, because that's how you inspire people to step forward. I've seen myself, and maybe some of you, I don't know, it's controversial sometimes in the climate community, but I personally believe that nuclear has a strong role to play in meeting net zero. There was a net zero sort of nuclear mission of one of the 10. And if I look at Hinckley near me, about 60 miles from my constituency, and I see 28,000 local jobs in that community, I see entire training colleges having been set up, and then partnerships having been established in Filton with other training providers. You start scaling this up across the country, you can really start seeing the next generation as being the net zero generation.
Do we need a Joe Biden IRA $360 billion stimulus to encourage that kind of?
So I think the Net Zero Review obviously called for upfront and clear investment, but we can be, I think, smarter about what that investment looks like. I wouldn't agree with thinking that we should be sort of fronting the upfront cost of OPEX. This is the challenge is the cost of capital. So I think there are inefficiencies with actually what has been developed. The importance to me with the Inflation Reduction Act is that the 45Q tax credit that's in place for companies to claim is guaranteed to the 1st of January 2033. 2033. And so having that understanding, and that's for projects that begin, they will still have it for the lifetime of the project, even after 2033. So having the long-term commitment doesn't actually matter what the scale of the money is, but knowing that the government is going to go in with you in this project is important.
Yeah. So Emma, what is your thoughts about attracting that kind of finance into the market?
I think this is where you need to get into the detail of what each sector needs in terms of attracting that different finance. I chair the Finance Institute, and the Finance Institute is working through transport, it's working through energy efficiency, it's looking at sustainable aviation fuels, and really getting into the detail of what will unlock that finance. We've worked with Oxford University and are about to publish a report that we've very clearly stolen in terms of the title of it. We've called it Mission Climate Ready, Unleashing Finance and Investments for a Prosperous Climate Ready Economy, because again, we know that this will work if we get the right type of finance, an enabling environment to unlock that finance. But often it can be taking the money that exists and shifting it away from grants into guarantees. So again, it provides some of that long-term security that will enable the private sector to get in and invest at the scale that we need.
Because Chris, as you say, it's not solely the responsibility of government. The private sector's got to get in as well. Question?
Thank you. So great to hear from both of you, Emma and Minister. I come from that nuclear community. I'm the Safety and Assurance Director for Sizewell C, which is the sister power station for Hinkley C. My question is one of appetite for change, really. We have great regulators and we've got a great democracy in this country. That means, however, that projects like ours, who need lots of complex permits, consents, are subject to potential judicial reviews. There's also a question of net zero, and I know that our regulators have made great strides in considering net zero, but the question is, how can we help them more and make the net zero duty that they would consider as part of the decision-making process? And how could we make the JR process a simpler one so that, for example, it's not possible for one claimant to JR a decision several times, which drives, of course, an attitude of risk, of a procedural risk aversion.
Yes. Yeah, and I think recognising what are critical national infrastructure projects is going to be a key requirement within that sort of net zero duty. And this is coming down the track, so when we look at planning, but this is where having a roadmap that sets out what are the opportunities to then engage at an early level, why local energy action planning, obviously not just from a major projects perspective, is important, because the sooner we have the opportunities to engage with communities, I think it's always, my experience as a Member of Parliament on a number of issues has always been that you're able to somehow smooth these down. For those that are intransient and are not willing to recognise that this is a transformation that must happen, we've got to be able to create a prioritisation, and that I think comes down to, I don't know what Emma feels, obviously having sort of worked in that regulatory space with the Environment Agency, but I did a review also with Jane Toogood, the UK's hydrogen champion, that sort of looked at regulatory innovation and where are the opportunities to bring regulators together, or to look at where we can simplify regulatory processes, where at the moment a nuclear project has to go to both the Environment Agency and nuclear approval processes, and why aren't they in the same stream? So there's, I think, definite innovation on regulation.
But it's a challenge so great that this is a moment to maybe suspend some of the democratic processes, to accelerate.
Well, I think part of that acceleration, so it depends what you mean by the democratic process, because the Town and Country Planning Act, and there are serious problems with legislation that's been in place as sort of a post-war era. There are serious problems with the divergent pathways for permitting and permissions that mean that very few people build out a solar farm more than 50 megawatts because you have to go into a different sort of permission stream. All this needs to change. At the same time, however, that doesn't mean that sort of we go back to a 1950s, 1960s sort of sense of energy as something that is done. I think we've moved beyond energy as a service now, and the more we recognise that sort of individuals can be co-creators in their energy transition is really important. So that's why climate assemblies are really important. What you've seen is actually some of those successful local authorities are the ones that have created the climate assemblies, that have talked through these challenges, because they're often the same people as ones who are, and then you have to say, look, this is the decision that you've come to in order to achieve net zero. Often before 2050, they want to do 2030, say some of these councils. We had the Climate Assembly. The Climate Assembly told us this is what they wanted. This is the reality of actually how we've got to deliver it. And when people have ownership over the decision-making process, they're far more willing to accept what needs to happen as a consequence.
And if I could just make a very, very quick point on regulation, I think where it can work incredibly well is where there is close working, often with the regulators being brought in very early so that they create the enabling environment to allow the projects to go through those permitting processes.
So I'm going to go over there. There's a light in my eye. I can't see so many people, so put your hand right up in the air. Is it far away there, and I'm going to come in the middle there. Yeah, over there.
Thank you. Janet Greenwood, KPMG, Chair of the Major Projects Sustainability Ambassadors. Chris, in your report, you talk about infrastructure being the key that unlocks net zero, and you've spoken about some of the policy blockers and some of the opportunities. What one thing should we all do differently tomorrow?
Very good question. So everyone used to ask me this about the review, saying, what's the one policy you want to take forwards? So if everyone was getting up tomorrow, what would I sort of recommend? I think for myself, we always think about net zero, as I said, at 2050. So there was getting to this stage now where thinking about, what do we need to plan out for 2030? And 2030 is only 78 months away. So if I were anyone in this room, there are projects that you'll be taking forward in the next 78 months, which may or may not be built in the next 78 months. But you must, I think, probably now have a sense of prioritisation of some of those projects that are coming up, hopefully before 2030, or maybe hopefully on track by 2030. Maybe it's worth everyone actually setting ourselves a challenge of making a list of saying, what are those projects that are taking place in the next 78 months, and what does that contribute? Because I think sometimes you focus on delivery of the project, but where does that going to sit within the UK's opportunity to deliver on its emissions reduction? So what I love to be able to see, companies coming forwards championing their role in meeting the emissions target for 2030. We had the Committee on Climate Change report that came out last week that said that the UK is on a track until 2027. After that, it's more difficult and challenging. And what we really need, and what policymakers really need, are not best practice, exemplars and ambition for delivering on 2030 and showing that actually what you've got coming up is a project that potentially could transform and contribute to the 2030 goal. Just one example, for example. So I was at Science Innovation Minister, yeah? So UK Atomic Energy Authority sort of came to me with a project, the Spherical Tokamak Energy Project, the STEP project. And they'd done the work, they planned it out, and they said, this is what we're going to do, and you've got JET in Oxfordshire and Culham coming off stream. We're going to move everyone over to ITER in France because we missed out on the opportunity in the 1980s to deliver a fusion facility to replace JET. But we've got a vision to thinking through of where we could do after ITER to come back to the UK with the Spherical Tokamak Energy Programme. And I said to Ian Chapman, I said, this is great, give me a 4-page brief and I'll take it to the Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings. And I was able to basically take that to them. And at party conference 4 years ago, Prime Minister announced the initial funding and transfer funding. And so I challenge everyone to look what's happening in the next 78 months. And are there projects that potentially you think could be delivered by 2030 or projects that could be started before 2030 that help contribute to that 2030 emissions
And if they don't
target?
contribute, take them off the list.
I think there is a sense of are we now working towards the future? Because the challenge is often, we think about our horizons as today, but there will potentially be some projects. And I said this with fracking. My challenge of fracking was not, the previous chief executive of Quadrilla said it's not going to work in the UK. So I said, well, if I was an investor, why would I invest in fracking in the UK? And actually, it's that economic sense now, is looking at those projects ahead of you and saying, the next 78 months, I need the investors to come in. Which ones can I frame in terms of that national ambition towards 2030?
Okay. There's a question there, going to go up the back after that. Far away, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Mitch Cook from Greengage. We're a sustainability consultancy providing advice into the built environment and helping our clients on that net zero trajectory and pathway. I think my question is, we don't see the lack of ambition in relation to innovation and clients wanting to do it, but the flip side to that is the policy position in terms of existing oil and gas exploration and production. How do we shift the dial away from that principal focus on oil and gas to a more renewable focus for primary energy generation?
Chris?
Okay, so the review was honest. We do need oil and gas for the future. The Committee on Climate Change, their balance pathway, set out we'll still be using 60% oil and gas for 2050. Obviously, we have a declining North Sea basin. We have the North Sea transition deal. The CCC would like to see that be more ambitious. I think it's about a social license of practice. If we're asking everyone else to decarbonise, if you're the oil and gas industry and you've got the funds to do so, you should also be decarbonising further, faster. And there are areas, for instance, where we could go further, faster on a methane flaring ban, which we've not committed to in 2030. Norway have had one in place on flaring and venting since 1971. It can be done. Why can't we get on with it? So actually we've got the energy bill. I've got a number of amendments coming down that have tabled some of the recommendations where I think the oil and gas industry can go further. The question now is one that I am slightly nervous around, which is a political question. Obviously we've seen protesters disrupt Wimbledon today, and their call is for no new oil and gas licences. And anyone who then says, well, we're thinking about new oil and gas fields, that we know the time lag between agreeing a new oil and gas field and actually the oil coming out of the ground is 24 years. So if we agree Rosebank, that's potentially 2047. I am not in the pay of Just Stop Oil. I've never spoken to them. I totally disagree with their tactics. But it is a mainstream political opinion to hold to worry about whether we are creating the stranded industries and jobs of the future. It's not fair on those industries if we don't have a considered conversation about what we need to do in the next 30 to 40 years. So in the energy bill, I put down an amendment to be debated shortly, which is I would, okay, you might think this doesn't go far enough, to create an expert body that would come back and advise on an end date for the future licensing of oil and gas, which would then be put to a separate vote by members of Parliament. I think that we've got to be able to recognise that this is not an extreme opinion, that we are going to be defossilising hydrocarbons for the future. The work that is happening is at such a pace that the actual demand for oil and gas won't be there in the way that it is today. And we've got to have those open, honest conversations without being categorised or denigrated as somehow being in the pay of Just Stop Oil, which I certainly am not.
Okay, talking about the new economic reality you mentioned earlier. Up at the back, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes just before we got a break for dinner. So is there a question at the back here?
Hello, Chris. Thanks for your talk. Temi from the Nichols Group. We've got a low growth economy at the moment, and investment is really key, as you rightly mentioned. And I wonder whether there is need for the government to reassess sort of the private sector investing more into this area, and to assess whether there are other policy levers that could be pulled to support private sector investment, considering inflation challenges at the moment, and lots of business sort of holding back on cash and not willing to invest, considering the challenges that we're going to face in the next year or two. So the key question is, are there other sort of policies, levers that could be pulled, perhaps fiscal policies, to sort of enable businesses invest in this area?
Chris?
So it's a really good question, because we've already seen this happening with auctions in offshore wind. We've seen now with the contract for difference on price so low now that there are certain companies now not even bidding into the auction because they can't stand up their supply chains. And so understanding that we need to, what do we value, as government and the public sector in procuring private sector contracts, needs to recognise the opportunities for building out future supply chains, maybe even for local content. Huge debates obviously around thinking about autonomy in the EU and what that means for establishing a green industrial strategy. If we want a green industrial strategy, it must be that we make sustainability sustainable for the future. So thinking, I think, better about the policy frameworks by which we provide the funding as government, the guaranteed funding. We've seen this obviously in the States with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the sort of price points that have been set for hydrogen, for direct air capture, for CCUS. We do need to think more intelligently about the people and the supply chains that are going to be involved in, and that we have that sort of factored in in the framework.
Emma?
And the Green Finance Institute came out of the government's Green Finance strategy. It was a joint venture between government funding and City of London corporation funding. It's now got other funders building it up. But again, it comes down to really rolling up your sleeves sector by sector, working with the private sector, working with policymakers, working in collaboration to understand what those policy levers might be that will make a difference to crowd in that finance. And a lot of it is about trust and consistency and confidence. But there's not just one thing that will work. You've really got to understand the detail, and that work is now being done.
Okay. We've got a break for dinner now, but just before we go, finally, the MPA is a learning organisation. From both of you, where can the major projects delivery profession look to learn to really accelerate this move towards net zero, and I suppose to start building out resilience? Chris, where can they look to? Where's the best practice?
Well, I think, I would say this as a former universities minister, but again, we are incredibly blessed with our academic institutions that now are all setting up net zero centres. I hope they're going to be sort of, look at how we can create this sort of networked approach to it. I'm now sort of doing some work at the Institute of Sustainability at Bath, for example, and they work on the built environment materials. It's very easy to get in contact with these organisations, and they are also desperate to demonstrate the applied nature of their research. And then, we had our Catapult network, and I have the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, the National Composite Centre in my constituency. Don't underestimate the power of potentially what you're doing anyway, being potentially also research projects for the future, and actually building these academic collaborations now could really help enhance your work. So if you're looking for someone to champion then your case for what you're doing, I would say reach out to the universities. And it could be that it's your local university that specialises also, and that helps sort of demonstrate the opportunity for you to be almost like a civic institution that's sort of giving back to your local community as well. So, we've been talking about the E and focusing on net zero, but also the S&G opportunities here for the projects you undertake. We've talked about the training and the learning and potentially the apprenticeships that might come out of it. Linking up with the university to help the graduates with future jobs is something you all do anyway, I'm sure, but potentially contact your university or contact the net zero centres that are potentially involved in your specific area and offer your services, and I'm sure they'll take it up with open arms.
Emma, final word?
So building on that, I think we need to recognise the scientific community. Some of that manifests itself in organisations like the Met Office, and the use of data joining up with the business sector can really help with driving that innovation. Certainly going back to the Environment Agency, a joint venture between the Met Office and the Environment Agency from a flood forecasting perspective. That information is also vital for the finance community. So I think this is where we'll see these new collaborations between universities, between others in the scientific community, engineering and finance to deliver the change we need.
Emma, Chris, thank you very much. I'm literally being chased off the stage, so thank you very much. Thanks to Chris Skidmore and to Emma Howard Boyd. Thank you very much. Andy.
Thank you, Anthony. I think a missed career on a select committee, perhaps. Thank you for two fantastic talks tonight and some brilliant questions and some really great answers as well. My sort of key takeaway, I think, from one of it was don't just do it, but do it well. And I think that's a gauntlet that we need to pick up when we sort of go back to our workplace and start scheming our next projects or the current projects that we're working on. So that's all for this evening's formal proceedings. We'll now be going to dinner, and if we can just go out the main doors there through to the Great Hall on the left. But before we do so, if we can have one more round of applause for our great speakers tonight.